Today I am going to show you how to instantly unlock your hip flexors, give you some exercises to help them stay that way. I'm going to give you the one stretch I want you to please stop doing. That's a lot. We better get to work. Maria here from goalietrainingpro.com. Let's go. We are starting with a little anatomy lesson today so that you can clearly picture the structures that we're talking about. You don't have to fully understand it, but at least you're like, okay, yeah, I sort of think I get it. So we are going to start with your two primary hip flexors, what we think of when we talk about hip flexors. Now, there are a lot of muscles that can flex your hip, including your TFL, including some of your adductors. And so sometimes we get, a tight TFL, which is a tensor fascia lata, which is attached to the iliotibial band. So some of you get a tight IT band and you're like, you need to stretch that thing. Well, the IT band is a connective tissue sheath. Like, good luck stretching it. But, we're always, or sometimes you get that, like an irritated adductor, an irritated groin. It's not a strain, nothing happened, but it's just giving you some pain. So I want you to, first of all, think, aha, if my primary hip flexors aren't doing their job the way they should, and maybe my TFL or one of my adductors is trying to do something that isn't really its job, like it's, you know how it feels. This isn't my job. It's going to get irritated, just like you would if you had to do someone else's job all the time. So the two primary hip flexors we're talking about today are the iliopsoas, which is sort of two muscles or maybe a common origin or a common insertion, but two different origins, and the rectus femoris. Let's first look at the iliacus. So it has that common insertion, but then it comes up and you can see it has a really broad attachment to the inner surface of your pelvis along what's called the ilium. So the pelvis is sort of three bones fused together, but those bones, different areas of those bones have different names. So that is the ilium of the pelvis, and that's where the iliacus attaches. The psoas, or the psoas major, comes up from that lesser trochanter. It kind of goes through your body, along the inside of your pelvis, through your body, and attaches to the transverse processes and the front of the vertebral bodies of your lumbar spine. So look at that, let that picture sink in a little bit. Be like, wow, this thing comes from my hip, through my body, and attaches to the front and the sides of my lumbar spine. That is, like, your mind should be blown right now. Right now. Okay, good. We're on the same page. The rectus femoris, this beautiful muscle here, is one of your quadriceps muscles. But what makes it special above and beyond all the other quadricep muscles is that it crosses both the hip and the knee. So it attaches to your anterior superior iliac spine, and then it goes down to your knee where it joins the patellar tendon and has a common insertion on your tibial tubercle. So it can both extend the knee and flex the hip. Like, the body's a miracle. Based on that mini anatomy lesson, can you appreciate how the rectus femoris, so the quadricep muscle that crosses your hip and your knee, is in a pretty good position to flex your hip this high, like parallel to the floor, but really not in a very mechanically advantageous, I think I just made up a phrase, position to lift it much higher than parallel to the floor. But then let's look back at our anatomy of 2.5 minutes ago and think, aha, that little iliopsoas thing you talked about with its attachments, it's in a not bad position to flex that hip beyond 90 degrees. So we're going to get back to that later, but I want you to have just a broad appreciation, not to say that the rectus femoris can't, but to have a broad appreciation of, hey, this muscle is in a better position to work in this range of motion, this muscle is in a better position to work in that range of motion. Now let's get down to business. How can you tell if your hip flexors are tight? You're like, well, how do I know? Well, sign number one would be like your hip flexors always feel tight. You always feel tight sort of in the front of your hips. Hint number 2 would be, you've got this big booty out the back and an anterior pelvic tilt. That can be a sign that these muscles are tight, so these muscles are tight and they're pulling your pelvis forward. And that in particular is that rectus femoris. And it's not uncommon because we sit with those muscles in a shortened position a lot of the time. So why wouldn't we expect that they're going to be short? So that's another sign. I'm going to show you a super, super basic version of a test that we would use in the gym when we're doing a hands-on assessment of an athlete. If you've been to the physiotherapist for, with some hip trouble, they've probably done this test on you. So we're going to need to get down on the floor. So what you're going to do is you're going to lie supine on the floor, which means face up on the floor. And then you're going to just hug one knee to your chest. And this leg is completely relaxed. And you're going to see, well, what in the heck happens to this leg? Because when I hug my knee to my chest, I'm actually tilting my pelvis back a little bit. I'm creating tension in this chain. So as you can see, mine stays right on the ground. It's like I don't see anything. I know this is stupid. I don't see anything happening. And that means that my hip flexors are actually in a pretty good state, flexibility-wise. Now, it does depend if my knee's bent or my knee's straight. And in fact, in the gym, we would do some different techniques off a treatment table. But for now, let's just go with it. Now, what would happen if when I brought my knee up towards my chest, this leg lifted off a little bit? That is suggesting, hey, there's some tightness in your hip flexors. Like you have no extension there. As we turn your pelvis posteriorly, your whole leg lifts up because there's no slack in here to let your leg get into extension. And again, we're not really going to worry right now with which muscle's tight. I think that's getting into the minutia for you. We're going to look at some techniques to help instantly release that deep hip flexor that's actually going to feel really good. You're going to probably do it every time before you go on the ice from now on. But I'm also going to give you some techniques to help sort of loosen up those muscles that cross your hip. So this is the instant hip flexor fix. And when I did this at one of the prospect camps I worked at, one of the NHL signed goalies was like, that was worth coming to this camp just to learn that. So what I want you to do, usually what we do is we walk across the floor a few times and just take a little mental snapshot of how our hips feel. Just a little mental snapshot. Then we hop down on the ground. Now this is hard because this is a little bit of an advanced technique. It's sort of a self-myofascial release technique where you're going to, instead of sort of moving a lacrosse ball or your hand over the fascia, you're going to try to tack down that connective tissue and then sort of move the muscle underneath it. It's a very, very subtle technique. So we're going to find our ASIS. So my ASIS is that bony prominence on the front of my hip. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to follow that contour of my pelvis. Remember when we looked at the origin of the iliacus and it was on that ilium of the pelvis. So we're going to try to get in there. And I'll use both my thumbs. So I come on the inside of that ASIS and then I almost try to follow the contour of my pelvis a little bit. Don't be pushing on your large intestine or anything like that. So if you're getting kind of some sharp pains, it's probably like, yeah, you're pushing on something you shouldn't be pushing on. Stay in that contour of the pelvis. It isn't super comfortable, so don't, if it's a little bit uncomfortable, like, hey, somebody's really getting deep and pushing on there, that's okay. But if you're getting pain, then you need to back off a little. So I'm digging in there and I feel, I feel like I've hit some tissue, I've hit an end point. Sometimes I'll just lift my leg a bit to see, hey, do I feel that contract? Do I feel it tense a little bit? And then that sort of tells me, okay, I'm on some of that hip flexor tissue. Then what I'm doing, and this is the really subtle part, I'm trying to just take my knee over my toe like that much. So it's not much movement. If you're rolling your pelvis or your bum's coming off the ground, you're not doing it. We're really just trying to lengthen in there. It's that much movement. And you're going to do 15 on each side. And when you finish doing that 15 on each side, then just walk across the floor again and feel what's the difference. What you'll typically feel, and what most people feel, is like, wow, it just feels like they're, like someone lubed it in there, like they're just swinging effortlessly. You know, maybe they didn't feel exceptionally tight before, but now it just feels like there's no resistance in there whatsoever. If you didn't feel that, don't panic, don't freak out. It's okay. They're weirdos and everything. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. You might have been on the wrong spot. Maybe you're just not an area that you're really restricted in. So don't worry about it. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these next two. They're just really basic self-myofascial release techniques. Lacrosse ball on my hip flexor. You can use a lacrosse ball, a squash ball. I have this little dealy-do that vibrates. And I think there is something to that vibration. I think it does help. But basically, you know, this is just a big global hip flexor. So I'm going to put my thumb across the crease of my hip. I'm going to lift my leg. I feel like a big rope, like a thick rope of muscle in here. I'm going to get on that area. I'll do it on this leg. And I'm not going to zip around. I'm just going to kind of scour and massage that area. If I find a little trigger point or a knot or a real tender spot, I'll just hang out on it. Try to relax those muscles and let that dissipate. I'll do 30 seconds of that. Then I'm also going to do 30 seconds of my quads. Foam rolling, and I'll use a foam roll because a lacrosse ball is going to be very, very uncomfortable. Could you use your massage gun? Yes, you absolutely could. But we'll just get in there and we'll kind of get all the aspects of the quadriceps. Working a little bit just on that tissue quality, just massaging away. 30 seconds on each side. In just a second, I'm going to show you the one hip flexor stretch that I absolutely want you to stop doing right away, please. But before we get to that, I want you to drop a comment. Let me know if you have tight hip flexors, if you've used any of these techniques that we've talked about already and how they've helped, or if you have like a secret sauce, like this is what I do when my hip flexors are tight. Drop it in the comments below. Once and for all, for the love of Tret Shack, please stop doing this stretch for your hips. My hips don't get this much hip extension. Nobody's hips get this much hip extension. Maybe if you're in Cirque du Soleil they do, but I really actually doubt they do. What this is lumbar extension. So you're not affecting the area you're trying to affect. You're actually stretching out your rectus abdominis, your abdominals, to let you get into more lumbar hyperextension. So that isn't accomplishing what you're trying to, even though you're like, no, I feel it in my hip flexors. Yeah, you feel it in your hip flexors, but what you're mainly accomplishing is learning how to get into more lumbar hyperextension. It's not a bad stretch to do, or the idea isn't bad. This is actually a really nice one for that iliopsoas, but here's how you have to do it. You have to get tall and start with this thigh right in line with your torso. And I know what you're going to say. I hear you. You're like, I don't feel that in my hip flexors. It's like, just give me a second here. Then what you're going to do is you're going to tilt your pelvis underneath you. So here's my pelvis. I'm tilting it underneath me. I'm doing a posterior pelvic tilt. And then you're going to feel a little bit of tension in the front of your hip, maybe the front of your thigh. It depends a bit which is most tight. And then you can push your hips forward a little bit. So not here, but here. Until you just feel a bit of tension in the front of your hips. That's all we need. You're going to hold that for 30 seconds. Sometimes we hold it as long as 60 seconds, depending on how tight you are. But make it relatively a gentle stretch. While you're doing that, I said that this was a pretty good way to get that iliopsoas. It depends a little bit which is more tight. If that rectus femoris is super tight, you're probably going to feel it in your thigh as well. But while you're in that position, we think of that iliopsoas and we think of it attaching to our lumbar vertebra. Can you see how, okay, we're going to get a stretch here, but if I reach and side bend, that might increase the stretch a little bit and get that stretch from the top down as well. So from the vertebra side down, not just from the hip extension. So that's another variation that you could add to your routine. And again, 30 seconds on each side is a great place to start. To get at that rectus femoris, we want to flex our knee because it crosses both our hip and our knee, remember? So we need to get flexion at the knee and some extension at the hip. Great way to do this is just having your foot on the wall. Make sure you have something really good to cushion your knee, otherwise it's going to be super, super uncomfortable. So that is a must. I'm using an AirX pad, but it could be a cushion, it could be your goalie knee pads, whatever you've got, but it has to feel comfortable on your knee. Another common mistake people make with this is they want to get right close to the wall. Well, if you're tight in your rectus femoris and it attaches to your ASIS, can you appreciate how it's going to pull you into more of an anterior pelvic tilt? So again, now I'm sort of stretching my abdominals and going into lumbar hyperextension. I'll feel it here for sure, but it's pulling me out of position. So start a little bit out from the wall. Again, you can tuck your pelvis underneath you to get a bit more stretch. And this one, you will probably feel more in the front of your thigh. Again, we hold that for 30 to 60 seconds on each side. Finally, we're going to do a little deep hip flexor activation or iliopsoas activation. I mentioned in the beginning how sometimes we're overusing muscles that aren't intended to be primary hip flexors, like our TFL or like our adductors, to do that action, and those muscles can get irritated, and it's just because the prime movers aren't doing their job. It's not even necessarily that they aren't strong enough. Sometimes they're just like a little stunned. We're all a little stunned sometimes. So this is a iliopsoas activation, and it's going to be really cool. I want you to do it with me. You're going to start off sitting on a chair or a bench or whatever. You're going to sit up nice and tall. So that's a key. You have to have your back in a nice neutral position. Then, without leaning away or tilting at all, you're going to just pick up one knee as high as you comfortably can. Make a little mental note. Okay, well, how high am I getting that? You can see mine's getting slightly above parallel to the floor. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Yeah, it gets about the same range of motion. And I'll just hold it there for like 3 seconds. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring that knee up as high as I can. I'm going to gently push down on it with my opposite hand. Gently. More is not better. Just like so. Of my max effort, maybe 20% of my max effort. And for 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So remember where my leg was the first time I did it, when I did sort of that little baseline test. And now look at how much higher it gets. So now it's clearly above thigh parallel just by putting my hip in a position where that iliopsoas is made to work, adding a little bit of load to it, sort of turning, I hate to say turning it on because it sounds like muscles turn on and off like a light bulb, but just giving it a little stimulus, priming that neural pathway, like, hey, here's what I want you to do, like training a puppy. So I'm going to do the same on the other side. So here's where I am now. I'm going to gently push 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then let's see where I'm at. So it's better. And so again, that's where the key to staying up tall comes from. Because if I'd like leaned way back, it's like, okay, now you're just cheating. So for that one, you'll do 1 rep on each side just as a little test. Then you'll do 1 rep on each side, pushing for 5 seconds with about 20% force. And then you won't push anymore. You'll just let that muscle pathway work. You'll hold for about 3 seconds, and you'll do 4 more on each side. So it'll be a total of 6. 1 on each side without pushing, 1 on each side with an activation with a little push, and then 4 on each side without pushing, just letting those muscles do the work. To quote Shakira, hips don't lie. And it's not just about, like it's uncomfortable, my hips feel tight. When your hips are tight, and in particular when your hip flexors are tight, we talked about how it changes the position of your pelvis, which then changes the position of your lumbar spine. It actually increases the compression and the shear force on your lumbar spine. Neither one of those things are things that we want. It also can increase the compression in your hip joint. So it isn't just about feeling tight, it's about how it's changing your whole biomechanics. It's how it's changing how you're using muscles, how these different muscles are coming in to try to help out, and then they're getting irritated because not my job. This routine I'm giving you isn't just something you do for when your hips feel tight. It's something that you have to do consistently, 4 to 6 times a week, to remodel that tissue, get it back to its proper resting length, learn how to use those muscles, and keep them working properly forever. If you do these even just once, you will feel dramatic improvements in how your hips move and how you feel on the ice, because it's about working on the right things. The answer isn't just working harder, getting stronger. It's working smarter than everyone else. If you just want a proven comprehensive program, and I mean for everything, mobility, functional strength, goalie speed and agility, goalie stamina, and you want me to help you along the way if you have questions or to help keep you on track, then check out the link in the description to see if you're eligible to join one of my online training groups and just to learn more about how it works. If you are having hip discomfort or just general hip stiffness, and you're not sure if, like, maybe this is hip impingement. You've heard about goalies getting hip impingement. You're really not sure whether this is something to be worried about. Then definitely check out this video I put together, kind of helping you navigate that. And of course, if you're really having hip discomfort, it's not getting better, it's getting worse, then it's time for you to go see a good sport physiotherapist to get a full, detailed, hands-on assessment. It's great to see you here. Thanks for stopping by. You look gorgeous. Have you lost some weight or new hair or something? You look good. You look darn good. Now I need to ask you a favor. Do you see that like symbol below? It looks like this. Well, not the face, just the thumb. Just looks like that. Would you do me a favor and click on that? Because it makes YouTube think I'm cool. Thanks. And while you're there, subscribe, of course. If you haven't subscribed already, I'll catch you next time. Cheers.